These are comments about our week 6 discussion. Apologize, I needed to get these to you faster. But this is my video reply, and I've taken notes over several comments from different people. One of the things I think overall everyone got a very good grasp of the 3 stages: denial, defense, and what I call a condescending or whatever. I've noticed in a couple of cases, I think the 3rd stage may have need some clarification. The 3rd stage is not one you naturally proceed to if you're in the defense stage, like this Greg Latique or whatever you call his name, strange last name. That's suspicious, isn't it? The way the guy spelled it in 9500 Liberty. The smiling evil man who was always calm and apparently very close to God, and the devil's right on his other side too. He's very amenable. But the minimization or condescending attitude is usually when people are beyond being aggressive in their attitude towards someone. They're not afraid of them. In fact, they've reached the point that they've gone in another direction other than defense. They actually discount, or I call it condescending, but they discount the importance of that individual's culture. In a way, I think it's even more dangerous because it's saying that if you encounter a group Y out here and you think that once that group has embraced and been acculturated or been melted into the melting pot, that they'll be okay. They just need to quit their culture and they'll be okay. They'll be like me. And I think that's even more deadly in some ways, because at least when you're on defense and you're aggressive toward another culture, you think about it. Unfortunately, you think about it with hatred, but at least you're aware of the differences, even those that you imagine are differences, and you see them as a threat to you. But in the 3rd stage, you don't see them as a threat, but you don't respect them either. And I think that's one thing I want you to take away from that. The best example I've seen personally, I dealt with a lot of people from the Marshall Islands, Polynesians. I guess Polynesians, you have to be careful in the Western Pacific exactly how you, some of you would know, the Marshallese are people from the island of Bikini, which is where we got the term bikini for a 2-piece bathing suit. And it's also the island where the first test run of an atomic bomb was used after World War II. They actually, I actually know the guy, or knew the guy, that his grandfather was the one that gave his island to the United States to use as a nuclear test range. And what did they get in return? They got permanent welfare or whatever. And so these people, they lived on a little island and they had lots of cars and motorcycles, but they couldn't go anywhere because the island was very tiny, very strange. But some of these individuals ended up in Oklahoma. In fact, in Enid, Oklahoma, I taught some of them, and they didn't fit in because there was no transition. They just took them from a island in the Pacific and brought them to Oklahoma and expected them to just blend in. And it didn't work out. It was very strange. Their customs were quite different. Idea of family and relationships and sex and everything was different from traditional Oklahoma. And so it was very, you could tell the group in town, they didn't adjust. There was a lot of problems. I don't know what's happened to the 2nd or 3rd generation since then. But the attitude was this 3rd stage, kind of condescending. We'll bring them here, we'll teach them about the Bible, and they'll just fit in. And of course, it didn't work. They may have gone to church, but they still didn't. They weren't adjusted to the local culture. And it was very strange. Why would you take people from an ocean in the middle of the ocean and put them in the driest piece of dry land in central South United States. You know, nothing could be different. It would be like taking someone from the jungles of Brazil and say, we're gonna bring you to Newfoundland, Canada, and you're just gonna fit in once we talk to you a little bit and you do a religious conversion. People didn't look into the culture, they just looked into saving their souls, and that was all they did. So I often call this the missionary position. This is that if you do that, then everything else falls in place, and that's not true at all. You may disagree with my opinion, that's fine. Some really good statements I saw in here. I know, Braden, you mentioned that how hate spreads, that LGBTQ community, and actually any of the communities, that once someone is able to claim, like this Greg Latique, we'll just call him that, may not be accurate. I don't respect him enough to learn the correct pronunciation of his name. But that fellow that was pulling the strings behind the scenes for the city council, 9500 Liberty, once he claimed that he was representing God, and that doing these terrible things to people was actually showing love for them. That is a very perverted statement. That is just pathetic. I know, because so many of you are so angry that this movie makes you angry, makes me angry. You know, I don't like to watch this movie anymore because it just makes me angry. I don't like to be angry. Now, hatred is, I thought about what hatred is when I was reading and that hatred is a natural response to something being wrong. Someone hurts someone you love, you don't naturally respond by compassion. You naturally respond by hatred, anger. But the problem with hatred is once it's rationalized and it's taken out of context, then people take advantage of that and manipulate that emotion to extend it to other people. For instance, when they made this agreement to stop people and check their papers, enforce immigration, then they didn't have a way to prove that they weren't stopping people because they looked Hispanic, or maybe they're, because a lot of people that are from the Caribbean or parts of Latin America, they may look like African Americans. How would you know? So you stop everybody that looks different than a white person. When in fact, a lot of people from Latin America, they are from all shades, all different physical features. And so these people didn't have a clue what they were doing when they wanted the police chief to stop them. And of course, he said we need to have video so we can show that we're not stopping people in violating civil rights law. They weren't happy about that. And they get desperate whenever you catch somebody doing something that's what I call evil or dishonest. They get really angry as you get close to cornering them. Rather than open up, they attack you. So that's one of the issues. That's why the police chief eventually came under attack himself. And it was really only because of his credibility within the broader community that a lot of this nonsense some of it was, a stop was put to it. The damage to the community was done, though. It became a very isolated community. A lot of people left. You noticed that. Other things, but Braden made that comment, and I just wanted to expand on that because it goes in many other ways. Several of you noticed, I think Kelly's the one who talked about when God is invoked, and I said, oh my gosh. And saving Manassas. Anytime you're saving something, how could anybody question? See, I'm saving you, I'm saving your culture. And your culture is not in danger. See, that's the thing. There are people here that are different, but you have to exaggerate all the threats from them in order to claim, I'm here to protect you, that's all. So I accuse your neighbor of terrible, foul things. The great quote here that Kelly made, returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. This is Martin Luther King. I'll give you credit for quoting him. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate, violence multiplies violence, and toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction. Great quote. I'm glad you brought that up. It's on the second page of the, but this is something you could put this into a, I don't know, it's kind of long, but I'd put it up on the wall in my classroom. A lot of people, Braden, you mentioned, I already talked about how this guy's over the top. I really do. I mean, when I look at this guy, Greg, I just see a guy who's like the devil's hand servant, out behind the scenes doing all these things. And it's interesting how once people become convinced, people in power become convinced that, hey, I can use this fear to build up my own support in the community. I can rally people to support me by installing fear in them instead of teaching them reason. It's a lot easier to stampede people. It's a lot easier to stampede a herd of animals by yelling or screaming and frightening them than it is to talk to them or soothe them. And Stephanie, you had this couple places, but in one of your replies, you said the mentality of not wanting to be wrong is so prevalent or common in our society that trying to have a civil discourse about anything seems impossible. I've already established myself. I'm right. If you try to argue, I can't possibly go back in another direction because I've committed myself to this particular viewpoint. That's very common. The human ego wants to be right, because you don't want to look weak by changing your mind, because we have this kind of a false masculinity or whatever. I call it ego myself. I don't want to call it masculinity, but just people are stubborn. They want to stick to whatever they've claimed. Jorge, you had a great comment on here. I noticed that several of you talked, when they talked about Che Guevara and the Zapatistas and these violent people in Central America or Southern Mexico or, in Bolivia. Che Guevara was an ally or a friend of Castro, and he's been memorialized as a great revolutionary. I don't think much of him at all. I think he's a bum. But people who become heroes in classic ways weren't necessarily very beautiful, but he makes great poster. I happen to like Abraham Lincoln. I got a shirt that says Abraham Lincoln is my homeboy. I mean, most people don't hate Abraham Lincoln. You really have to go out of your way to hate him, but there are people. But Jorge, you mentioned that multiple times during the documentary, Latino community were labeled as instigators of violence. Whether there's too many of them living in a house, whether somebody tagged a sign with a gang sign, a stop sign or someplace, then all of them become at fault. Somebody doesn't have a job and this guy's working for less money on a house. He stole my job. That's always a pathetic argument. And this whole idea that it hurts our school system to have diversity in there and American students are given Spanish language instruction. Anybody that's a foreign language teacher or really an American language, because Spanish is in this country like a lot of Chinese and stuff, that somehow learning a second language, that's the old hatred of second languages. Going back into the 1920s when people began to hate foreign language instruction. Don't teach German, don't teach Spanish, Those are inferior languages, these people would argue, and it's ridiculous. Of course, that, I think you guys knew this, Greg Latique. He was busy getting emails and stuff from outside that little town of Manassas. He had thousands of emails and stuff. And these were people all over the country because he could focus their hatred and swamp them with emails saying, look at all these people are emailing you and they're angry. You better do what they say. That's an attempt to intimidate people. And also he claims he was defending white culture. And this is a really touchy thing, but you think about what is white culture when people use that term. I mean, what is it? Is it Irish? Is it German American? It's some generic thing that no one quite knows what it is, but they think they know what it is and they're protecting it. And so I think you have to look at when people use that term. That's why when people say they're defending white culture, it almost never means they're at least in my opinion, they're using it for ulterior motives to try to go after minorities. Claiming that they're protecting this majority or the way things are is a threat, you know. I mean, it's being threatened by others. So that's the kind of thing, you know, you say that and people get very upset if they're right wingers. They say, you don't respect our culture. I said, well, of course you have culture. Everybody has culture, but what is this thing of white culture? Like, people that are white all over the United States are all basically the same? Are you claiming that? I mean, it's ridiculous. Another comment that I liked that Jorge made to Zaida was the scales of awareness. I had the intuition that migrants also live inside of themselves these three moments, beautifully stated there. And the first moment is being invisible. And the fact is that the group that is receiving this treatment, whether it's homeless or someone who just newly arrived in the community, they live within that. Being invisible. I mean, I'm not saying that being invisible is always bad, but I'm saying generally it's not healthy. If something bad happens, if you become ill, if you have an issue and nobody notices you, who's going to look after you? Who's going to protect you? Who's going to call an ambulance? People say, oh, that homeless guy down there, well, they live in the street. Who's going to be merciful to a person they don't see, literally don't see? I mean, yes, they know they're there, but they're not going to go out and it's not like a member of their church they see in trouble. So I like the way you said that in these moments, because our lives are moment by moment. And I don't know if I can get this across, but whatever's happening with the side doing the siege mentality or defending, the other side is subject to that. And they live within the context of that, either being hated, being ignored, or in the third stage, condescending. What matters to them inside them, their culture is being ignored. People say, well, I care about you, whatever your name, but I know that in your country, you're here now, you're going to be like us. But maybe I don't want to be like you. I want to be distinct. And I think that every human being wants to be appreciated for who they are inside, and not just what they look like and how they seem to fit into the overall scheme. I want to respect the individual, their thoughts, their opinions, things that are precious to them, important to them. They're not to be given up for another culture's whatever, whether it's a god or another culture's way of acting, or trying to teach somebody to love English literature when they truly love the literature of their home country, Japan. And I hope that's clear. Maybe that's a little odd, but your defense there, your observation there, Jorge, was very interesting. Some other things I noticed. Joe Jensen, you mentioned this Daryl Davis. I got to look him up. An African-American man that somehow persuaded many KKK members to quit their group. I don't know quite how that happened, but I'm going to go and look that up. What it means is that you can appeal to the reason in people and to their sense of fair play, and that they can be persuaded to change. there's a cognitive aspect of us that connects with our emotions rather than just manipulating our emotions for kind of evil purposes. What are some other things? I felt, and I'm going to go back to Stephanie on this. You were commenting to Michelle. He said, the stage one was happening for years before the documentary was filmed. People didn't worry about minority culture in the town of Manassas or the homeless people. These people, this stuff happened gradually over time. People didn't even pay attention. They may have noticed there was a Hispanic family in town or a group Y appeared in town. But at that point, they weren't threatened by them. They didn't really pay attention. They just ignored them completely until one day somehow somebody rang the alarm and said, we've got to worry about these individuals now. Alyssa, you mentioned that Greg Latique had this smile and he said, slavery was God's plan to teach us right from wrong, and then tried to defend the Civil War as maybe like some kind of suffering that we all needed to go through. You know, I have a problem when people make a statement that I inflicted all this terrible pain on this other group of people, which is perpetrated by your ancestors, in order to teach you a lesson. That's screwy. Sorry. I don't buy into that argument at all. You know, I don't want to go on too much longer because I'm doing one of these for each group. I felt that as a group, everyone was gained a lot from this video and from this discussion about this video. And I hope that it increases your sensitivity, your awareness of when you detect speech like this. Sometimes hatred comes in very subtle ways. It's not, someone will, for instance, somebody's on a scholarship or an awards committee at your school, and suddenly you notice that certain people are just not getting any awards or recognition. And you may say, well, it's funny, but a certain group of people here are invisible on the scholarship awards. You know, and how might they justify that? And I've observed this myself over the years. Some people say, well, they didn't have quite as good grades as some other people, or they weren't in as many organizations as the other people. And you know, those are perfectly good rational points as far as they go. But the problem is, sometimes when you award scholarships or you award things like this, you're also looking at what people did within the circumstance they live in. Maybe they have to work all the time. They can't be a member of all the organizations. Maybe they need to spend more time. I mean, maybe they weren't able to get as high grades. Maybe they had learned English very well, or they had been behind because of a poor background in education, and they only got a 3.3 or 3.2 instead of a 3.9 GPA. And sometimes people can come up with, and I'm not accusing them, but they can come up with these barriers, with these requirements that are so high that only a certain kind of person ever qualifies. And that certain kind of person may tend to be all from one particular group, whatever that group is, okay? So that's real subtle stuff. I consider it very serious. And I speak up when I see things like that. So, you know, it's the kind of person will say, well, that group, they're getting a lot of extra help from maybe it's a group of kids from a rural area that are very poor, and they weren't as academically strong, so their GPA is not going to be as strong. Does that mean that only the people with straight A's should get? Because you'll hear stuff, people say, well, we got 3.9 or higher. How come we didn't get all the scholarships? Well, not all the scholarships are based strictly on GPA, because if they were, then of course that's how it'd be. But I just want to remind you of that, because when it comes to giving out awards, I don't advocate a quota of certain people, but you have to consider the conditions. And there are individuals that do incredible things, but they may not come out with the highest performance, whatever way you want to measure that. So are we strictly just looking at one perspective, one criteria, or do we look at the whole thing? Okay. I'm just adding this in because I think it's important. And this stuff here about these 3 stages, that impacts that when people are making decisions. And then if they say, well, you know, that group never qualified, they just don't have this, then I have a real problem, because unless it's some rigid thing, you know, one criteria, you have multiple criteria. And in your life, you have to think, what has this person done with what they have? You know, I mean, I'm thinking back biblically to say, well, the person that gives the most money to the ancient church, that's the best person there. Whoever's the most generous must be the best person. But that's ridiculous. Some poor people may give a lot more of what little they have. You know, that old biblical story. But the point is, that's what I think we need to be aware. And I'm adding this because not everything's like 9500 Liberty. A lot of this stuff is pretty nick. Oh, a couple other things that I wrote down. Kylie, you brought up people were upset that these illegals are having babies invading our country, not with weapons, but with their babies. Now, I find that hard to believe babies are a threat to you. Anytime you say the birth of a child is a threat to you, you're pretty pathetic. And that did come up in this statement. And you've heard the term anchor babies. People say, well, they have a kid here so they can try to illegally stay here. And I don't like the word illegal. I don't use it. And when you get to the point you're attacking unborn children, unborn, whatever. We had a situation in Nebraska when a former governor refused to give WIC, which is food for poor expectant mothers, refused to give that to mothers who were not here legally, were not documented, even though their children would be born. And if they were born with some issues, health, physical, otherwise, probably the state would somehow end up picking up some of the tab. So it was like, you're an unborn child, but if you're in the wrong womb, well, by gosh, I'm not going to give any money to sustain you or help your mother. How does that sound? Okay. All right, so think about that one. And then, Rachel, you mentioned about how the town was in denial about the benefits. Think about the advantage of being bilingual, multilingual. Think about the advantage of having people that are willing to work at some pretty rough jobs where you need to hire people that are willing to do the work. I can talk about meat packing. I can talk about working construction. That's not something that a lot of people say, yes, I want my kid to grow up and work in the meatpacking business. And then they'll say, no, I'm not against hard work and I don't mind digging ditches. But every time I hear somebody say that, they don't want their kid digging the ditches and they aren't digging the ditches. We're using a ditch witch to dig the ditches. So, but the point is, people deny, and I had people tell me years ago, they say, oh, I could work at the meatpacking plant or I could do this, but I choose not to. And I'm thinking, you can't work at the meatpacking plant. You wouldn't last the day. You get sick from the gore, or you get sick from just having to do the work, or it'd be too cold for you, or it'd be too rough and there's too much pressure. You wouldn't last the day. I said, if individuals like you had to work in meatpacking but didn't have the immigrants coming in, steaks would cost $50 a pound, you know? Okay. I'm just getting over a really bad ear infection, and just now I'm starting to feel a little better. I had a rough couple of weeks. anyhow, I'm going to be doing another video on my other class over the same topic. So this is just for you guys, and I hope you enjoy it. And I really appreciate your discussion, and that's why I take the time to read over these and comment on these. I like it a lot better than just typing out little thank you, interesting, all that bogus stuff that people say, great job, excellent. I say that, but it's the texture of the individuality, response, and I hope this is better than that. So thank